So we have worked out our new audio-visual layout, and I know folks said if you want to see pictures better, you can come up front, and like in church, nobody comes up front, so there you go. So it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, and many of you know Eric, who, if you work in research or have attended other conferences. I'm not going to give a long introduction, just to say that in my mind, Eric Kirchler is the professor of economic psychology in the Department of Applied Psychology in the University of Vienna, Austria. And I have known and now worked with Eric since 2014 when I met him in Australia, I guess it was, and was so impressed by what he was talking about in his approach to taxpayer behavior and what drives compliance that I immediately tried to hire him, which I was successful to contract with him to do some work for my office, but also to invite him to come here because I think, to my thinking, his approach really explains a lot and provides a lot of avenues for exploration as we as tax administrators or thinkers about tax and practitioners of tax try to achieve that holy grail of voluntary compliance. And so without saying anything more, I think I'll just turn it over to Eric.
Yeah, it's a pleasure working with you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to talk to you about psychology and taxpayers' behavior. You know, I'm a psychologist. I don't understand much about behavioral economics and almost nothing about law. So forgive me if I say something which is not legal or in the context. Okay, the work which I'm going to present is not my work alone, but it's joint work with the people in my team in Vienna, people who are working with us, who were working with us in the past, and a lot of guests and people with whom we work on an international level. What would I like to do in the remaining of the time? How much time do I actually have? It was 1 hour, but I guess it's less now. All right. What I would like to talk about is social representations and attitudes about taxes and taxation. You know, psychologists usually start by assessing what people might think about an issue. And yesterday we had an interesting presentation by Lynn, who was investigating the contents of social media. And that would be one of the data pools, which also in psychology we would look at to understand what people think about an issue, in that case about taxes, because we assume that social representations and attitudes, more concretely, determine people's behavior. I will then talk about determinants of compliance and research paradigms, which were developed in the past and are still very dominant at present times. I will talk about tax paying as a decision under risk. Well, this will be just one slide because I understood from the presentations and the comments in the audience here today and yesterday that nobody of you believes in the home economicals anymore, although this is probably the paradigm which is still dominant both in economics, in law, and in politics. I will briefly mention the importance about understanding the rules, the law. If you want people to behave in a certain way, they have to understand what is the right way to behave. I will talk about the importance, very briefly, of services and norms and fairness, the complex issue of fairness and justice. And then move on to interaction climate, how that shapes people's behavior, and present the slippery slope framework, which is nothing but a combination of the insights which have been acquired in economics and in psychology. And then perhaps I have time to talk about behavioral insights with the final slide. Okay, the fundamental activities of the state are collecting revenues to fund public activities. We use taxes, charges, and levies to influence people's behavior of markets and organizations, and taxes are also used as an instrument to redistribute excessive differences in wealth. Especially progressive taxation is an instrument to redistribute wealth. And if you look at whether people, let's say nations in that case, like all these activities, then the answer is clearly yes, they do. There was a study in 2011 by Oishi and his colleagues at Diener, where they compared the degree of progressive taxation in different countries with national well-being, national happiness, if you want. And you see there is a correlation, a positive correlation. The higher the progression of taxation, the happier people are. This is on the aggregate level. On the individual level, which is more in the focus of psychology, things might be slightly different. We asked people about what they think, whether there should be, the state should spend more tax money for different public goods, whether there should be spent less money for different areas. We asked about that in one of the past studies, and we asked people how much they contribute to the different fields of expenditures and how much they deserve, how much they should get. And what we found in this study was that the picture people have in their minds about where tax money should go is a differential one. For example, you see here people would prefer spending more money for education, science, and research. I was quite astonished by that. But less for social security and so on. But when you then ask what they think about how much they deserve, then you see all pluses. People contribute a lot, but it's absolutely not in balance with what they get out of what they do. So knowing about the aggregate level and taxation and relationship with national well-being and happiness, and knowing about what might go on the individual level, I think it's important to understand what people think about taxes and taxation, to understand what their attitudes are. Well, if you look back at the definition in 1618, a thesaurus of tax inspector, it says that, well, the representations were not always positive. And perhaps not much has changed. We are still collecting data for a study on the evaluation and description of different kinds of taxpayers. We ask people, what do you think about honest taxpayers? How are they? And then we have an instrument which allows us to differentiate, to extract the evaluation, whether somebody is perceived as positive or negative, and different descriptive aspects. We ask about honest taxpayers, typical taxpayers, tax avoiders, and those who evade taxes. And what we found so far in the data which we have collected was that honest taxpayers are evaluated quite positively. They are nice people. You see the blue bar goes to the right side, which is the positive evaluation side. The typical taxpayer is more or less neutrally perceived. Tax avoiders, they are great. Evasion, after all the media news, is not so good anymore. It was better 20 years ago. Those who evaded were very clever, perceived as very clever at that time. Who are the hard-working people? Definitely the honest taxpayers, but also tax avoiders are those who are perceived as being very hard-working. Whereas the typical taxpayer, like me, not liking to pay taxes, but there's no way to escape, you have to do it. The typical taxpayer is not really hard-working. And what is interesting, I think, is that those people, the typical taxpayer is the most stupid one, whereas all the others are intelligent, especially those who evade and who avoid taxes. Avoiding taxes, in people's mind, is something which is absolutely not wrong. In 2014, the Bund der Steuerzahler, Nordrhein-Westfalen, a union of taxpayers in Germany, did a survey and found that the Germans have a tense relationship with taxes. However, they feel it is important to pay what they should pay. Tax mentality, this report says, has deteriorated. People, 85% of the people feel a high tax pressure, and 2/3 claim the temporal and financial burden to file taxes is too high. So it's really hard to do what you have to do. It's very costly. The tax system is unjust, that's what many say, and 95% claim the government spends money too thriftlessly. So they don't spend the money for the people, but they don't spend it very carefully. Well, these are, I think, important findings because the attitudes are more or less directly related to tax mentality and tax morale. Tax morale is indeed an important variable, as we have found, we have seen in various psychological but also economic studies. For example, there is this quite interesting study by the people around Frey, Torgler, and Schneider, where they correlated the degree of tax morale in different countries with the size of shadow economy. Shadow economy is usually used as a proxy for tax evasion in a country. If you look at that, you see this correlation is quite impressively negative. The higher the tax morale, the lower shadow economy in a country. All right, so what do we know? People have a kind of lax attitude towards paying taxes. Hiding, evading taxes is not the right thing to do, but if you avoid, perhaps even aggressively avoid taxes, that's something which is widely accepted. At least in my country, it seems that that's okay. What are the determinants of tax compliance? What can you do in order to keep those who want to be cooperative, to protect people from those who try to exploit the system, the free riders? What can you do? Well, the first ideas which came to our minds was controlling and punishing those who are not obeying the law. You perceive in this approach tax paying as a decision under risk. A taxpayer is confronted with two alternatives. One alternative is the safe one, the sure option. You pay what you have to pay and go away with a net income. That's fine, whatever happens in the future, audits or no audits. But the taxpayer has also the possibility to choose the risky option and might go away in the lucky situation with more than just a net income or with less, if he or she is discovered evading and fined. So what to do in such a circumstance? Well, the first ideas which come to our minds are you control, you increase the probability of audits, and you punish those who are not obeying the law. That it's in such a case, it wouldn't pay to go for the risky option. There's a myriad of studies out there in the laboratory, survey studies, field studies, and so on, which investigate the effect of audits, audit probability, and fines. And indeed, in most studies which are very clearly designed, the laboratory studies, you find that audits and fines are relevant. Deterrence matters. Deterrence is important, but there's a big but. In many studies, you find the effect is much smaller than you would expect theoretically. Audits and fines matter, but the effect is not really a very impressive one. And there might be more determinants of behavior. The effect of audits and fines is sometimes even opposite to what you intend. For example, if you have heard about the bomb crater effect, then you will immediately see that, well, if you do a one-shot audit and don't look at what's coming in the next years, in the next future, you don't understand the full impact of audits. You have to look at the future effects. The bomb crater effect would say or predict that people, once they are audited, feel that of a next audit in the upcoming year is quite low, and they will be left in peace and can easily try to get back what they had lost in the former years. Sometimes fines are perceived as just the price. If the fine is not appropriate, but it's a price, there, of course, the deterrent effect is not given at all. But don't misunderstand me. I think audits and fines are necessary. They are necessary, but it's not the whole story. I would like to control what Mencken said once. Command and control is a simple answer, in my view, to a complex phenomenon. And he said, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. Enforcing tax compliance. Again, audits and fines are necessary, but there is more which we have to take into consideration. There is more, and this more has been investigated in the last decades in some very isolated, small scale, and also, richer studies, field experiments, and so on. First of all, I think it's important that people understand, that people have knowledge and understand what they have to do. Since the law is complex, services are necessary. And I think we have heard a lot today about the importance of services and the difficulty to get the service which you need. Social norms are important. Usually people do what the others are doing. We are following the crowd, not only in the stock market, but in general, I would say. So communicating about what the others are doing, what the majority is doing, is influencing people's behavior. And then, of course, fairness. Distributional fairness, especially also this procedural fairness and retributive fairness, have been investigated a lot. And there is a bulk of studies out, and I think there's no study which would not come to the conclusion that fairness is not important. It is important. What about the complexity? Jeffrey Owens, together with Hamilton, published a study in which they counted the words in the entire income tax, in the entire tax code and the income tax only. And what you see here is that from 1955 up to 2000, the income tax only grew from 200,000 words to over 1 million words. So the complexity alone from that picture has been growing a lot. By the way, Jeffrey Owens is the one who will do the next conference in Vienna. As Nina has told us, it's not me, so be nice to him. He was the former tax chief of OECD and now working at the Economics University in Vienna. Tax law is not always clear. I was trying hard to find in the literature estimates of the years of the reading age which you need to understand the tax code. I didn't find any after Alan Lewis' study in 1982, but at that time he found out that in the US, in UK, and in Australia, you need 12 to 17 years of reading age to have a chance to understand the tax code, which most people don't even approach in our countries. Nina, you wrote in 2013 that taxpayers hire preparers because the tax code is hideously complex. Return preparation is anything but straightforward, and a lot of money is on the line. And if you look at what the Australian colleagues did at the beginning of the 2000s, they investigated, Valerie Braithwaite, together with her people, they investigated the reasons why people use a tax preparer. And the major reason is because they don't understand the tax law and they want to sleep quietly during the night. That's the reason, not to get money back or not to pay taxes at all. So there were lots of effort to simplify the tax law, which seems not easy, not only in the US, but also in Austria. I think we don't have really a chance to come to a clear, simple tax law, which should be possible to write on one single page. That's one of the German tax lawyers proposes. We did a study with the Dutch in the Netherlands. They do a lot of surveys with entrepreneurs and private taxpayers, single taxpayers. In that study, we asked people what kind of services they are using in the Netherlands. They can use they call the authority, they can go to and have face-to-face contact, they email, they write letters, etc., etc. What kind of services do they use, and how satisfied are they with the different services, and so on. And what we find in 2 samples of about 1,000 private taxpayers and entrepreneurs was more or less the same picture. Services are directly related to tax compliance. If people can use services, they have access and are able to use services, tax compliance is increasing because services facilitate doing what people should do. But what impressed me very much was this very strong relationship between services and trust in the institution. If the services are perceived as positive, trust is likely the outcome, and via trust, tax compliance is increasing as well. So you have a direct and an indirect path from services to compliance, one directly, one via trust. And you see here the results for the 1,200 entrepreneurs in this study, pretty much the same, not much change. Services are important. And we heard that also from the IRS Commissioner John Koskinen, if I pronounce it correctly, yesterday. He was talking about compliance through enforcement and service. I would like to change that a little bit and say through enforcement, power, coercive power, but also trust, because service is one of the determinants of trust, and trust is what is important. Fairness and social norms. I just want to bring one quote by Bo Rothstein, a sociologist, who says, 2 conditions need to be fulfilled to ensure that people pay taxes. Taxpayers need to trust that other taxpayers are paying their share, and rather than filling the pockets of tax bureaucrats, tax authorities have to ensure that the money is invested in public welfare. So you have to be sure that the other are doing what they should do, and you have to be sure that the bureaucrats in that case are pursuing the goals which people have. I don't want to go into details with regard to fairness. There's a lot to say about fairness, but has been said a lot from the perspective of taxpayers. Just to remind you, distributive fairness is important. You have giving and taking have to be balanced, but perhaps procedural fairness is even more important if you want to strengthen trust in the institution. All that relates very much to individual tax behavior, especially tax evasion. But perhaps tax evasion is not the big problem today. Henk Helfers wrote already in 2000, the gloomy picture of massive tax evasion is a phantom. And I was looking, before coming to Washington, I was looking at the homepage of Friedrich Schneider, an economist in Austria, who is usually estimating shadow economy worldwide, and you may be against, pro and con his technique to measure it. It's a difficult issue. But in that 2015 estimation, he finds that shadow economy has declined in the US to 5.9% of GDP. In Canada, it's 10.3%. In Switzerland, 6.5%. So it's going down in the last years. Perhaps it's not shadow economy, but what we are doing, what we are observing, is aggressive taxation, tax filing, which is completely legal, but not, as we heard yesterday, in the spirit of the law. The problem is tax avoidance. And again, Owens in 2004 already said, modern organized non-compliant business acts within the law, exploiting the law's shortcomings and loopholes. That's the problem. Do you know this guy? I learned it's the 6th richest man in the world. It's Amancio Ortega Gaona, Spanish, who owns Zara, Massimo Dutti, Bershka, and so on. Has $70.7 billion US. I learned from the news agency Bloomberg that in his firm, his enterprise, Inditex, owns a company located in the Netherlands, and this company is a very small one, employing 173 people. Those 173 people are extremely productive. Alone in 2013, they made a profit which is higher than the profit of all these firms in Italy, France, Germany, and Great Britain in the past 5 years. In other words, each employee made a profit of 3.1 million euros, or this small company is 7 times as profitable as Apple. I think these are the real problems nowadays. You know this one? All what they are doing is completely legal, and this is the problem. Of course, I think we will observe that law will change. There may be, for sure measures which will be taken. But I think besides an international consensus how to jointly regulate tax-paying behavior of people and businesses, and doing something clear and strict against this aggressive tax avoidance, profit shifting, etc., etc., I think it is necessary, and that's the social psychological perspective, it's necessary to establish a sense of wrongdoing in the society. It's the people who have to have an interest, that businesses, that self-employed, that taxpayers in general do what is for the common good. And we learned that after the harsh criticism, for example, in Starbucks, when people went to on the streets, that Starbucks was paying something, whatever it was, to HMRC. Definitely not taxes, as Alison told me in spring in Antwerp. Starbucks paid voluntary money to the HMRC because of people who were protesting against their tax habits. So what would I say as a psychologist? What do I think is necessary? I think it's necessary to change the perspective of how we see people, how we see taxpayers. They are not rational, egoistic utility maximizers, all pursuing the same goal, all being black sheep who need to be controlled and fined. That's not what is the case. Most people have a kind of intrinsic motivation to cooperate with the larger community, with the state. And most people are interested in securing public goods by contributing to them. So we need to see people as social beings interacting in a social system. And the strategies to ensure cooperation are creating a positive interaction climate, a climate on the dimension of trust and power. The OECD is more or less suggesting the same when they talk about cooperative compliance or the enhanced relationship program in the past. The horizontal monitoring approach in the Netherlands, but also in Austria, in Slovenia, and various other European countries, is an approach where you perceive taxpayers, especially corporations, big businesses at the moment, not all taxpayers, you perceive them as equals. Rather than having a vertical monitoring strategy, you approach them on the base of mutual trust, understanding, and transparency. I think all these programs relate to what we call the importance of interaction and summarizing the slippery slope framework. As I said before, the slippery slope framework is nothing else but a combination of economic and psychological insights into one huge framework. And this framework, we have a few important crucial variables which we consider. One is the power of the authorities. It's the perceived potential of tax authorities to detect and punish evasion, free riding. And the next one, the next dimension is trust in authorities. It's taxpayers' perception on tax authorities as pursuing the same goal as the people. Benevolent, working for the common good, that's the base of mutual trust. And we talk about enforced compliance and voluntary compliance. I think in most studies, colleagues, researchers are not distinguishing between enforced and voluntary compliance at all, but they talk about compliance in general. Well, this is the framework, the slippery slope framework. What you see here is that we distinguish between power and trust. The power of the authorities can be low or a maximum. Trust in the authority can be high or low. Depending on whether the authorities are powerful, they control efficiently and punish free riders. Depending on that, the compliance would be high. In that case, enforced compliance. You enforce people to do what they have to do. If trust in authorities is high, voluntary compliance should be the result. The climate, which we thought at the beginning would be created by exercising power, is an antagonistic climate based on command and control, audits and fines, whereas trust results from understanding what you should do, low complexity, tax morale, personal and social norms, societal norms, and all the fairness considerations which I've only briefly mentioned. We would say, on the one side, the power of authority is the capacity to detect evasion and punish evasion. On the other side, you have authorities' benevolence and investment in the common good. This is the whole idea of this slippery slope, and we have tried to test these ideas in several experiments in the laboratory, in service, and so on, assuming at the very beginning that power would be negatively correlated with trust. Either the authorities are powerful, then you don't trust them, or they are trustworthy, then in that case they wouldn't audit or not be harsh to taxpayers. Recently we did a study in 44 countries. In those 44 countries, we asked people to imagine living in a country where authorities are trustworthy and powerful. Powerful and trustworthy, both was manipulated as being high. Another subsample in all those countries was confronted with a scenario which said the authorities have neither power nor are they trustworthy. And in two additional samples, we presented the authorities as either powerful or trustworthy, and not the other thing. So you're powerful, you have powerful authorities, but you can trust them, or the authorities are trustworthy, but not really powerful. These are the countries which we have investigated, and what we find was a very clear picture. Intended tax compliance is highest if power is high and if trust is high. So that was opposite to what we intended in the theoretical elaboration. We find that if the authorities are powerful and trustworthy, in that case, you pay your taxes, or at least you say you would pay your taxes. On the other hand, if power and trust are low, you don't pay. We also find that power is related to enforced compliance. People feel that a pressure to do what they should do. If they can trust the authorities, they are spontaneously following the rules. They're not taking deliberate strategic decisions how to minimize their tax burden. We then looked at what's going on in all those 44 countries. In all these countries, from Australia to the US. And what you see here, if you can see it, are green bars, yellow bars, blue bars, and the red bars. What are they saying? The green bars are the intended, indicating the intended compliance when you imagine living in a country where authorities are powerful and trustworthy. The red bar indicates the opposite. Authorities are neither powerful nor trustworthy. And the yellow bar is one where power is high, trust low. The blue one indicates high trust but low power. What we find in these 44 countries is a very clear picture with regard to high power and high trust. In all countries, people say they would be compliant if the authorities were trustworthy and powerful. In all countries, we find that people are least compliant, at least they say they would be least compliant, if power and trust are low. But what I find interesting is the differences between countries when either power is high or low and trust is either high or low. You have several countries here marked with this yellow arrow in which higher power, even if trust is not increasing, would lead to more compliance. And the blue ones are countries where people say the authorities need to invest in trust. Then we are more compliant in that case. And what is your guess? In which countries would people be more compliant if authorities invested more in power? In countries like the US, UK, Germany, or in countries like India, Pakistan, and so on. We guessed wrongly. We thought in countries like Pakistan, Indonesia, you would need to invest in power. That's not the case. What we find here, in all the OECD countries marked with an arrow, with a blue arrow, in these countries, people say if the authorities were more powerful, if they exercised more power, we would be more compliant. Whereas in the countries like India, Iran, Pakistan, Indonesia, Egypt, and I think Morocco was the last one, people say they need to invest more in trust. We need to trust them. In that case, we would be more compliant. Now, we were not really sure what this means. Why would that be the case? And we started now to think about all different kinds of power: coercive power, legitimate power, professional power, expertise, etc., etc., and distinguish between coercive power, legitimate power, reason-based trust, and an emotional, spontaneous attitude to trust somebody, in that case, the tax authorities. The ideas which we are pursuing now, hopefully with some collaborators here, are the following. We are talking about legitimate power and reason-based trust being either high or low. And my guess is that if you're living in a country with high legitimate power and high reason-based trust, you have a reason from your experience with the authorities that you can trust the authorities. And you also experience that authorities are high and they have low coercive power, that in such countries people would voluntarily cooperate. They don't take a decision. They just spontaneously do what is the right thing to do. If coercive power is high, the picture becomes more complex and the situation probably more interesting from the perspective of research. Imagine living in a country where the authorities are pursuing the same goals as you do. They are benevolent, you trust them. They have high power, they have really efficient tools to control misuse of the whole system, and they are very coercive. In that case, coercive power could be perceived as well-targeted to those who are not doing what is in the common interest, what is not legal in that case. In that case, coercive power would lead, we assume, to voluntary compliance as well, because you feel protected. Protection and security could be the resulting emotions. I don't know many studies about tax-paying behavior and emotions, but I think emotions are important, and we would find, I guess we will find that the targeted coercive power is related to protection and security. And probably in our countries, coercive power is, at least from a group of taxpayers, perceived as protective power. If it's not targeted, but used to, or perceived as a power which could be directed to everybody, then legitimate power and trust will decline. We assume that if legitimate power of the authorities is low and reason-based trust is low as well, that in that case, coercive power, if the authority has no coercive power, people evade. They just don't do what the law says. But if coercive power is high in such a country, in such a situation, such a system, and well targeted, then the resulting feelings would be prudence. People are alert, think about what they can do, what they can risk, and they are feeling enforced to pay taxes if the audit probability is high and fines are high. On the other hand, if under the condition of low power and low trust, high coercive, non-directed, non-targeted high coercive power, in these situations people could either react with anger or fear. In case of fear, you feel enforced to pay what you have to pay. But in case of anger, you may take a rational decision and try to escape the system wherever possible. This is work in progress. These are speculations. We don't have data on that now, but perhaps it's a path to understand what's going on in people's minds, what people feel, how people interpret power and trust, and then to understand what kind of cooperation, what kind of compliance they will choose. A few closing slides. We transformed this data in the various, which we collected in various countries, into indices of power and indices of trust in the different countries. And what we did was correlating these indices, our indices of power and trust, with corruption as measured by Transparency International. What we find that power and trust is highly correlated with corruption indices in countries. If you're living in a country where people assume or perceive, think that authorities are very powerful, but also very trustworthy, in that case, the corruption index is very high, which means it's low. Corruption is low. A very high correlation. We looked at shadow economy in those 44 countries and correlated power and trust perceptions with the shadow economy as measured by Schneider. And again, we find a substantial correlation between trust, power, and shadow economy. In countries where you trust the authorities and they are powerful, shadow economy is quite low. And finally, we correlated all these indices with national happiness as measured by Veenhoven. And if you're living in a country where authorities are quite powerful but trustworthy, happiness is highest. Well, to conclude, I think I really am convinced that audits and fines are necessary, but they're only part of the whole story. If the authorities are powerful and trustworthy, then people seem to be most willing to cooperate. Power matters, but power must be legitimized, must be professional, must be experts who manifest power. Power of authorities is effective if citizens trust the authorities. Trust is necessary as a basis of power. Without trust, power is not working as it should. Cursive power is also necessary and effective, but only if it's well targeted and if it's used to prevent those who are cooperative in the whole system from exploitation from those who are free riding or trying to free ride. At the end, I would just like to conclude by, repeating what Giovanna Dieghi yesterday said in her speech. Giovanna, you said that it's important to perceive taxpayers as clients, not as subordinates, but as clients. As a psychologist, forgive me if I go a bit further, and I would say we, the people, we read it several times on the slides, we, the people, run a business. We are the entrepreneurs of a state, and the authorities are our employees. We could consider them as employees rather than us as the clients. Thank you very much.
What's the role of respect of authority? It's always seemed to me that the Americans have true respect for authority. They got a letter from the IRS. They believe it. May not agree with it, but they believe it. Whereas in other countries, I don't think they have that same sense of authority. That's right. It play a role in all of this, in your mind.
Yeah. Well, what I experience in Europe is that the authorities are perceived quite differently in the different countries. In Austria, the authority is perceived as the authority. Yeah, they have the right to do what they do. You are the subordinate. It's still to a certain extent, the culture of the emperor. If you go to Switzerland and ask people about tax paying and why they are more honest, even if taxes are not held at source, yeah, which would be opposite to what you hypothesize in psychology. In that case, people should be less honest. In Switzerland, they are more honest, but they would say, well, I need to know how much I pay for my employees. I run the state, they are my employees. Yeah.
Thank you for a really fascinating talk. I'm really sold on this slippery slope framework, especially for individuals. You mentioned about the corporate tax avoidance. So my question is, do you think the slippery slope framework has any application to corporate tax avoidance, like the Intertext and the Apple and so on?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, this is a question which I don't get the first time. We have a hard time to investigate corporations. But what I would say as a psychologist is that even in corporations you find people. And the corporations are acting and behaving within a social system. Depending on how the climate is in the social system and what people accept and do not accept, they might behave differently. That's why I think that what we observed in UK with Starbucks is so important and teaches us that if people have an opinion in favor of contributing to the public good, in favor of the spirit of the law, then they exert pressure to corporations. I think via that path, the slippery slope would explain some behavior of corporations as well.
I just wanted to ask for some clarification. On your matrix, basically, with power and trust, you say the OECD countries are more likely to expect, the people there to expect a high power and high trust will lead to more compliance. But in some of the other countries you mentioned, about 4 or 5, that the power, the feeling is whether the power is legitimate.
Yeah.
And if it's not, if it's not perceived as legitimate, why would trust make a difference there?
Well, I was a bit fast talking about that, and I don't have a lot of data to really explain what's going on. But the first idea which I have to interpret these results is come from social psychology and the relationships between power and trust. What they find in their studies in different contexts is that power is not working if there is no trust. Power works well if people trust the authority or the powerful entity. So that my guess is that in our countries, in many OECD countries, trust in the authorities is quite high. Yeah? Although we have a lot of problems which need to be solved, as we have heard yesterday and today. But it's quite high. And what you want to see now is that authorities exercise power, even coercive power, but very well targeted. Yeah? In other countries where trust is low, power is not working. Corruption is high, shadow economy is high. You first need authorities to whom you can trust. And then you think about whether you're collaborating with them or not, and whether you accept the power which they accept or not. But that's a guess. And the question is, what kind of role feelings play, perception of targeted coercive power or not targeted coercive power? That's a program for our research in the future.
Thank you.
While the microphone's coming, can I try and delve a bit further into the questions of power and trust? On power, there's a little bit of a danger of saying that the implication from your analysis is that the more power, the better. But is there a point at which power becomes disproportionate and has a negative effect? We had a discussion, for example, briefly yesterday over drinks about naming and shaming, and whether naming and shaming is seen as disproportionate. And can I also delve down a little bit into the question of trust? When you say trust, is it trust that the tax authorities will keep confidential your information, or trust that they will exercise discretions reasonably, or is it trust in the whole government system, that the government is not wasting your money on schemes that are useless and computer schemes that end up wasting billions of euros and produce no effect? What exactly is the trust in?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think when you talk about shaming, naming, blaming, all these retributive justice issues, this is quite important. Of course, there are many cultural differences regarding what you accept and what you're not accepting. I think in Austria and Germany, blaming and shaming are not well accepted, for example. Not as much as in Australia. It's a guess, which I have. What is trust? In our conceptualization, trust is originating from understanding what you need to do, complexity or simplicity of the law. Trust results from your understanding or knowing that other people do what they should do. So social norms, the communication and knowledge about social norms. And trust results also from distributive justice, having giving and taking in balance, and of course the whole issue of procedural justice, being treated neutrally, correctly, benevolently, etc., etc. And when we design our experiments, usually scenarios, in that case, we describe situations by talking about all that variables.